Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye.
Are there any other senators? If not, the yeah. Are there any senators who wish to vote or to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 71, the nays are 26. The nomination is agreed to.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Sorry to interrupt.
Under the previous order, a motion to reconsider is considered made and laid on the table. The President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate will resume legislative session. The Majority.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that we now proceed to period of morning business. Senators allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
From Tennessee.
I believe the senator from West Virginia is, if he's going to speak, I'll wait till after he speaks if he's not ready.
Just bringing out a slender.
Okay.
Mr. President.
Mr. President. Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I understand that the senator from West Virginia is going to have the floor, followed by the senator from Tennessee, and I'd like to be recognized at the conclusion of the remarks of the senator from Tennessee.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
The senator from West Virginia.
Are we in morning business? Can I speak as if in morning business?
The senator is correct.
Mr. President, just over a year ago, my good friend Senator Mark Kirk of Illinois and I launched a new caucus here in Senate. Our purpose was to bring attention to the problem of unemployment among our military veterans. Mark and I looked at everything the Department of Veterans Affairs and other government agencies were doing to help veterans find jobs, but we felt that the private sector needed to be more involved. So we created the Senate Veterans Jobs Caucus. Today, the Senate Veterans Jobs Caucus is now the Congressional Veterans Jobs Caucus, and it's a bicameral, bipartisan group of 37 senators and 46 House members brought together by a shared commitment to the newest generation of veterans. And this week, we are kicking off the caucus's activities for the 113th Congress with a Day on the Hill, an event highlighting our work on behalf of veterans, particularly our showcase program, I Hire Veterans. Not only will we be recruiting more members of Congress to join our caucus, but we'll also be enlisting more businesses to join the 8 major corporate partners that have already joined our ranks. These corporations expect to hire about 200,000 veterans in the next 5 years. The members of the Congressional Veterans Jobs Caucus are leading by example. We're hiring veterans to work in our Senate and House offices. You'll probably see the signs as you go by our offices, I Hire Veterans. It's a logo displayed proudly in our offices. The same logo you will also see in the businesses that share our commitment to veterans. Our I Hire Veterans program is basically our new yellow ribbon, a special welcome home and a commitment to serve those who have served our country in the most difficult and dangerous circumstances. Mr. President, there's no sugarcoating the fact that the job market is tough, especially for our young veterans. Unemployment among these veterans has reached crisis proportions, according to the latest data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Listen to these figures, if you will. It's astonishing. The veterans age 18 to 24 years of age, their unemployment rate is 31.3%. 31%. Even more staggering is the jobless rate for female veterans in that same age bracket of 18 to 24, and that's at over 55% unemployment. The employment situation isn't much better for members of the National Guard and Reserves because employers are reluctant to hire somebody who may be subject to being called to duty. And this generation of National Guardsmen and reservists are coming home from a decade of repeated deployment that in many cases interrupted or delayed their careers or education. Many of them are just now realizing how difficult it can be to jumpstart school or a career. If we don't do something, it's going to get worse. With more than 100,000 servicemen and women expected to re-enter civil life each year over the next 5 years, their challenge to find jobs is only going to intensify. Listen to the veterans and you'll be surprised when they tell you that sometimes the stress of finding a job in a tough economy can match the stress of combat in some of the most dangerous and distant places in the world. Imagine for a moment that you're 21 and just back from the rugged streets of Kandahar, reunited with your family, and you're going up and down the streets of your hometown, looking for a job week after week with no luck at all. That's real stress. That's pressure. And that's what more than 3 out of 10 of our young veterans are experiencing right now as we speak. Like every generation of American warriors before them, today's veterans make great hires. They lead by example, they understand teamwork, they're flexible and open to change, they're tech savvy and talk about performing under pressure. Even in the most stressful situations with limited resources, they get the job done. Mr. President, after World War II, with the millions of American GIs returning home, President Harry Truman appointed General Omar Bradley to run the Veterans Administration. Bradley was a popular choice, and his steely approach to helping veterans was widely admired. Bradley's marching orders to the VA were simple, and I quote, "We are dealing with veterans, not procedures, with their problems, not ours." You'll find that same kind of commitment in today's generation of veterans in the Congressional Veterans Jobs Caucus. It is simply unacceptable that when the courageous Americans who fight our wars finally get to come home, they have to fight for jobs. The Congressional Veterans Jobs Caucus is committed to making sure that doesn't happen. America has said it is time to bring our troops home. After a decade of war, incredible sacrifice by our warriors, the homecomings are well underway. It's not always easy to come home from war, but the homecoming will be easier if we fulfill our obligations, and that includes making sure our fighting men and women come home to a job. After all, as General Bradley said, we are dealing with veterans, not procedures, with their problems, not ours. And I would ask all of my colleagues here, we have 37 of our senators signed up to this Veterans Jobs Caucus. I would hope that we would have 100, and we're going to be working hard to that. I want to thank my good friend, Senator Mark Kirk from Illinois, helping launch this. We've worked together. We will continue to work with all of our senators. We appreciate it and thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President,
The senator from Tennessee.
I ask consent to speak in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I've come to the floor to attempt to clear up some confusion about Senate procedure. And the confusion I'd like to address is that some observers of the Senate seem to have a hard time telling the difference between a filibuster that's designed to kill the nomination of a cabinet member or a judge and a motion by the majority leader to cut off debate. Let me say that again. The difference between a filibuster that's designed to prevent the nomination of a cabinet member or a judge on the one hand, or a motion by the majority leader of the Senate to cut off debate. There's a big difference. But sometimes I read in the newspapers that Republicans are filibustering, for example, Senator Hagel, as if a majority of Republicans or a majority of the Senate intended to deny the nomination to Senator Hagel through a filibuster, when in fact what most of the Republicans were saying was the nomination of the former senator has come to the floor only 2 days ago. We have senators who've got legitimate questions about the nomination, and we'd like some time to discuss it. In that case, we were forced to have a vote on a motion by the majority leader to cut off debate on Thursday before the recess, even though the Democratic leadership in the White House had been told by Republican senators, enough of us, that if we voted after the recess, there would be plenty of votes to make sure that the president's nominee had an up or down vote, as we have done throughout history in the United States Senate. Now, for whatever reason, the majority leader in the White House felt that they had to push through a vote and then went into a large complaint that Republicans are filibustering the president's nominee, Republicans are obstructionists of the president's nominee, when all we were doing was doing what senators historically do, which is ask for sufficient time to exercise our constitutional duty of advise and consent. Advise and consent is our best known constitutional responsibility. Books have been written about it. Movies have been written about it. Speeches have been made about it time after time. If we don't do it, we would be derelict in our duty. And so there's a big difference between asking for time to exercise our constitutional duty for advise and consent and using a filibuster to prevent the nomination of a cabinet member or a judge. I went back through history as best I could. The Congressional Research Service has issued a report on what has happened throughout the Senate's history on cabinet members and judges. On district judges, according to CRS, no district judge nomination has ever failed to be confirmed because they failed to obtain cloture. Did it take some time? Were questions asked? Yes, of course. That's part of the process. But the fact is, no district court nomination has ever failed to be confirmed because they failed to obtain cloture. So if the majority leader will wait a sufficient amount of time for the minority members to have their questions answered, a district judge in this body today, and we've proved it time and time again, will not be denied his seat because of a 60-vote cloture vote. There will be an up or down vote on a district judge. Mr. President, the same is true so far with a cabinet member. The only exception I have found is when the Democrats unfortunately used a cloture vote, a 60-vote requirement, to block the nomination of John Bolton, President Bush's nominee to be U.S. representatives to the United Nations. Now, some presidents include that position in their cabinet, some do not. But aside from that singular incident, which I point out was the Democrats saying that they're going to filibuster a nominee by the president and deny him a seat, so far as I've been able to tell, there's not been ever an instance in the history of the Senate where Republicans have used a filibuster to deny a cabinet member an up or down vote when nominated by a president. That only leaves appellate judge nominations, circuit judge nominees. Up until 2003, so far as I've been able to find, the rule of the Senate was that the president's nominees to be on the federal courts of appeal always received an up or down vote. They were decided by a vote of 51. Then our friends on the Democratic side, when President Bush became president, decided they didn't like that, and they changed the practice. They began to filibuster President Bush's judges for up or down, to deny them their seats. I had just arrived in the Senate in 2003, Mr. President. I was really very upset by that because I knew some of the nominees. I knew about Miguel Estrada. I knew how Charles Pickering in Mississippi had been a pioneer in the civil rights movement when people said he was not. I knew that William Pryor had been a law clerk to the Honorable John Minor Wisdom, the federal courts of appeal judge for whom I clerked in New Orleans. I knew these were good people. They just happened to be conservative. They just happened to be Republicans. And so our friends on the other side of the aisle said, we're going to filibuster and kill those nominees. There were three others, Priscilla Owen, Carolyn Kuhl, Janice Brown. All cloture votes failed. There was no final vote. And then there were four more in 2004, so 10 altogether. Democrats, for the first time, filibustered to kill 10 of President Bush's judges. That produced a reaction. That produced Republicans who said, okay, we're going to change the rules of the Senate. We're going to make this a majoritarian institution. We're going to decide these questions by 51 votes. Well, cooler heads prevailed, and we adopted a consensus that only in extraordinary cases would federal appellate court judges be denied their seat by a cloture vote, by a 60-vote margin. In every other case, it would be 51 votes. And based on the research I've been able to make, only 2 circuit court nominees have failed to obtain cloture and were not confirmed of President Obama's nominees, and those were Caitlin Halligan and Goodwin Liu. So the bottom line of history is no district judge has ever been denied his seat or her seat by a filibuster. No cabinet member, with the exception of John Bolton and the Democrats, if you want to count that, has been denied his or her seat by a filibuster. And as far as circuit court nominations go, the score is 10-2. The Democrats have filibustered to death 10 of President Bush's nominees, and Republicans in return have filibustered 2. I think that's an unfortunate precedent. I would like for the Senate to go back to where it was when even a nominee such as Clarence Thomas for the Supreme Court of the United States was decided by a majority vote. So, Mr. President, in addition to that, of course, there's the question of do we filibuster legislation? And the answer is yes, we do. And sometimes we do on either side to kill a bill. If a bill comes over here to abolish the secret ballot in union elections, I imagine Republicans will do their best to kill the bill with a 60-vote margin. Democrats would do the same with a right-to-work provision if Republicans were in charge. That's happened throughout history. And with lesser nominations, that's happened. If a National Labor Relations Board nominee is controversial, there might be a 60-vote requirement. Even with the Tennessee Valley Authority. I remembered when the distinguished majority leader held up President Bush's TVA nominees because he thought that the president should have appointed Democrats instead of Republicans. I pointed out to him that the law didn't say he had to do that, but the majority leader, who was then the majority leader, he may have been the whip then, said that, well, he was going to hold them up anyway. Well, I couldn't get him to stop doing that till I held up somebody that he wanted from Nevada. So this has gone on throughout history with lesser nominees. It's a part of the advice and consent of the Senate. It's a way we gather information. It's a way we make a point. It's the way we sometimes get something in exchange. It's a power that an individual senator has. And with all the powers that we have, it should be exercised with restraint. I mean, if all 100 of us exercised all the privileges we have at any given time, nothing would happen. So let me conclude by remaking my first point. Advice and consent is the best known responsibility of this Senate. It is a constitutional duty. We exercise it diligently. It often involves some delay. It often involves asking for more time to consider someone, getting information that was not easily gotten before. Every senator knows that the time to ask a nominee about an issue is before that nominee is confirmed. They're able to talk about something, it seems, easily. Their appointments are not hard to get. So that's a part of what we do every day. But I hope that the observers of the Senate will make a distinction in the future between the majority leader's effort to cut off debate and the minority's intention to kill a nominee with a filibuster. Because we don't do it with district judges, never have. We don't do it with cabinet members, never have. We've done it twice on the Republican side with appellate court judges. Democrats have done it 10 times, both unfortunate precedents, I think. But with cabinet members and judges, that's the record. So there's a difference. There's a difference between asking for a reasonable amount of time to debate and exercise advise and consent and a filibuster with the intention of preventing the nomination entirely, finally, of a judge or a cabinet member. I thank the President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, while the senator from Tennessee is on the floor, and because he referenced the filibuster of district judge nominees, let me say that there was a concerted effort to try to filibuster a district court nominee, one in which Senator Reid of Rhode Island and myself had a particularly keen interest since we'd recommended this candidate to the President. And it was a senator from Tennessee, along with 10 of his Republican colleagues, who decided that that was not in the best traditions of the Senate and who voted against the filibuster and to allow cloture so that the precedent remains that district judges will not be filibustered. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank him for doing that and to let him know that he has my gratitude for that. I think it was in the best interest of the Senate. I don't think the senator did it in order to gain any gratitude from me. I think he did it because, as a matter of principle, he thought this was the way the Senate should behave. But I certainly do appreciate it, and I want to take this moment to say so. I'm here, actually, Mr. President, to once again urge Congress that we really have got to wake up to the growing threat of climate change. The alarm bells are ringing, the signs are all around us, yet we continue to sleepwalk through history, ignoring the warnings from the scientific community, from economists and business leaders, even from our military, of long-term shifts in the climate of our planet. Another alarm has now sounded, this time by the Government Accountability Office, the taxpayers' watchdog. For the first time ever, the threat to the federal government of climate change has been included on the Government Accountability Office's high-risk list. Every 2 years, at the start of a new Congress, GAO, the Government Accountability Office, provides the House and Senate with a list of program areas that are at high risk. GAO is the government's nonpartisan auditor, and the high-risk list is its catalog of threats to the integrity and performance of the federal government. I quote, "Solutions to high-risk problems," says GAO, "offer the potential to save billions of dollars, improve service to the public, and strengthen the performance and accountability of the U.S. government." House Oversight Committee Chairman Darrell Issa has called the high-risk list, I quote, "the most important report published." And as we face the indiscriminate spending cuts of the multi-billion-dollar sequester, Chairman Issa pointed out that, and I quote again, "the list represents tremendous opportunities to save those billions of dollars," end quote. It's enough, actually, to prevent the sequester that we're careening towards twice over. Only 55 issues have been elevated to the high-risk list since it first began in 1990. The current list comprises 30 big-ticket problems, such as improving defense program management, protecting the nation's cyber infrastructure, and modernizing federal health programs. When a problem reaches GAO's high-risk list, it shouldn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican. These issues must be among the top priorities of Congress and of the nation. Add now to this list of serious national problems the destabilizing fiscal risk posed by climate change. The federal government and our military, and by definition the American taxpayer, owns and operate hundreds of thousands of buildings and extensive infrastructure in every state, including utilities, flood control and navigation systems, power plants and distribution networks, and irrigation systems, not to mention the usual roads and bridges. The federal government also manages about 650 million acres of land for grazing, for timber, for conservation, and for recreation. That is nearly 30% of the total area of the United States, and climate change is affecting virtually all of it. The overwhelming majority of climate scientists tell us that the air and oceans are warming, that sea level is rising, and that we are changing the very chemistry of our oceans. These changes some of them unprecedented in human history, increase the risk of extreme weather like heat waves, floods, droughts, and storms. As GAO points out, federal assets in every corner of the country are at risk. Storms crashing into the southeast, wildfires burning throughout the west, and floods inundating the northeast are not just local problems. Droughts draining aquifers in the Midwest, warm temperatures melting permafrost in Alaska, and rising, warming, more acidic oceans eroding our national coastline and threatening life in our seas. These are not just local problems. Climate change is a high-risk threat to our shared national well-being, our shared national wealth, and our shared national heritage. The GAO high-risk list sounds yet another alarm that we are fools to ignore. For instance, GAO found that neither the National Flood Insurance Program nor the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation is prepared to deal with climate change. Between 1980 and 2005, the flood insurance program's exposure quadrupled to nearly $1 trillion. The crop insurance program increased 26-fold to $44 billion. Yet, GAO reports, these programs have not even developed, and I quote, the information needed to understand their long-term exposure to climate change, and not yet analyzed the potential impacts of an increase in the frequency or severity of weather-related events. Now, major private insurance companies like Allianz and Swiss Re, Munich Re, and Lloyd's of London have for years been developing strategies to address climate change. But our federal insurance programs don't even have the basic information to address these risks. Understanding and preparing for these risks is essential to protect our communities from catastrophic loss. According to NOAA, the value of flood insurance coverage in my home state of Rhode Island was $2.2 billion in 2011. The Ocean State has received $57 million in payouts since 1978, some of which helped Rhode Islanders recover from our record floods of 2010 brought on by extremely heavy rainfall. Folks who have flood coverage through the National Flood Insurance Program should know that heavy rainfall has increased in the Northeast by 74% since the 1950s. And scientists predict that warmer air will continue to increase the frequency of heavy rainfall and consequent flooding in the Northeast. Disaster aid is expensive. FEMA has obligated more than $80 billion in federal disaster aid between 2004 and 2011. Another $50.5 billion in emergency aid was just approved for the northeastern communities devastated by Hurricane Sandy. PSE&G, New Jersey's largest utility, plans to spend $4 billion over 10 years to make its electric and gas systems more resilient to these severe storms. New Jersey's second largest utility, JDP&L, announced it intends to spend $200 million to do the same. According to Gene Fox, who's a commissioner on the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities, and I quote, "This is a cost of climate change, pure and simple." Mr. President, it is really time for us to wake up. In the private sector, the insurance and utility industries are facing the threat. Congress must now act responsibly. House Oversight Committee Ranking Member Elijah Cummings asked GAO Comptroller General Gene Dodaro if it was, and I quote, "GAO's opinion that regardless of the outcome of global negotiations to reduce carbon emissions, the United States government should take immediate action to mitigate the risk posed by climate change." Comptroller General Dodaro responded with a simple and unequivocal yes. In the high-risk list, GAO states that despite any possible future reduction of emissions, and I'll quote, greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere will continue altering the climate system for many decades, end quote. That's the way the laws of physics and chemistry work. Damage with lasting consequences is already done. But many effects of climate change can be mitigated, and it's the responsibility of this Congress to help our nation prepare and adapt. Some federal efforts are underway. In 2003, the U.S. Department of Transportation initiated a study of climate risks to Gulf Coast transportation, and it's now cooperating in that study with the South Alabama Regional Planning Commission. The Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service are developing a drought vulnerability model, a carbon storage map, and an alpine monitoring program to help land managers in southwestern Colorado cope with the effects of a changing climate. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have a climate-ready states and cities initiative to help local health departments prepare for changes in health risks driven by climate change. EPA partnered with New York City's Department of Environmental Protection to develop a software tool that helps drinking water and wastewater utility operators understand how climate change poses risks to their facilities. Rhode Island, I'm proud to say, is one of many states that have formed a climate change commission. The commission is coordinating with federal officials to identify specific state and local challenges that are presented by our changing climate. 20 other states have similar climate action plans developed or underway. Despite the actions by states, the actions in the private sector, and the warnings in the GAO high-risk list, special interest politics in Congress prevents the federal government from using our resources effectively and efficiently against this threat. The polluting special interests have Washington gripped in a barricade of obstruction, and the effect truly is disgraceful. Consider, for example, NOAA's proposal to create a national climate service akin to its renowned National Weather Service. This was a no-cost restructuring that would have centralized NOAA's work on understanding the climate, including its observations of climate change. The National Climate Service would have helped meet the growing local demand for climate change science information. But this proposal was blocked by Republicans over in the House who simply don't want to hear about climate change. That kind of thinking will not get climate change off the high-risk list. According to GAO, and I'll quote again, the nation's vulnerability can be reduced by limiting the magnitude of climate change through actions to limit greenhouse gas emissions. While implementing adaptive measures may be costly, GAO continues, there is a growing recognition that the cost of inaction could be greater, and given the government's precarious fiscal position, increasingly difficult to manage given expected budget pressures. Mr. President, Congress has been asleep long enough. We have a tradition in this body of taking the accounting of GAO, our nonpartisan watchdog, seriously, and of taking GAO's high-risk list seriously. GAO now joins our defense and intelligence communities, our scientific research communities, our state and local governments, and major sectors of private industry who have all elevated climate change from their to-do list to their must-do list. Mr. President, it's time for Congress to wake up to its duties and to get to work. I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Go ahead, please. Mr. President,
The Majority
I
Leader.
unanimous consent to call the quorum be terminated.
Without objection. The Republican Leader.
Mr. President, I ask consent that the Inhofe-Toomey bill at the desk be considered as the bill that qualifies for introduction under the February 14th consent agreement.
Without objection.
I now move to proceed to S-16 and send the cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the motion.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 19, S16, a bill to provide for sequester replacement. Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with provisions.
I ask consent that reading of the names be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
I unanimous consent that tomorrow, February 28th, at a time to be determined by the Majority Leader after consulting with Senator McConnell, that the Senate proceed to vote on the motion and vote cloture on the McConnell motion to proceed to calendar number 19, S16. That if cloture is not invoked, the motion to proceed be withdrawn, and the Senate then proceed to vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the Reid motion to proceed to calendar number 18, S388. Further, if cloture is invoked on the McConnell motion to proceed, the motion to proceed be agreed to, and the Senate resume consideration of the Reid motion to proceed to S388, and vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the Reid motion. If cloture is invoked on the Reid motion, the motion to proceed be agreed to, and if motion to proceed to S16 was previously agreed to, the Senate then resume consideration of the bill, and upon disposition of S16, the Senate resume consideration of S388 if the motion to proceed was previously agreed to.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. The Majority Leader.
Consent that we proceed to period of morning business and is allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I ask consent that the Senate proceed to calendar number 14, H.R. 307.
The clerk will report.
Calendar number 14, H.R. 307, an act to reauthorize certain programs under the Public Health Service Act and the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act.
Is there objection to proceeding the measure? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I ask the committee report to substitute be agreed to, the bill as amended be read a third time passed, and the motion to reconsider be made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that we now proceed to S-Res 61.
The clerk will report.
S-Res 61, designating March 1st, 2013 as Read Across America Day.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, the motion reconsider be laid on the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent that we proceed to S-Res 62.
The clerk will report.
Res. 62, to authorize the production of records by the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations of the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs.
Is there objection to proceeding the measure? Without objection, so ordered.
As unanimous consent, the resolution be agreed to. The motion we consider be made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, adjourn until 10 a.m. Thursday, February 28th. Following the prayer and the pledge, the warning hour be deemed expired. Adjourn the proceedings be approved to date. The time for the two leaders be reserved for the use later in the day. And following any leader remarks, the Senate proceed to a period of morning business for an hour. Senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or the designees, with the Republicans controlling the first half, majority the final half. Further, the following the morning business, Senate resumed consideration, move to proceed to the American Family Economic Protection Bill.
Without objection.
So, Mr. President, at a time to be determined, there will be two cloture votes on motions to proceed to sequestration-related bills offered by the Majority Leader and the Republican Leader. Senators will be notified when the votes are scheduled. If there's no further business coming before the Senate, I ask that the Senate adjourn under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. on Thursday.
The Senate today approved the nomination of Jack Lew to be Treasury Secretary on a vote of 71 to 26.